We negate result. The United States should remove nearly all of its military presence in the Arab Spring states of the Persian Gulf. Contention 1 is instability in Iraq. Sectarian tensions are high in Iraq as the Kurdish ethnic group has been targeted by the central government. Polini 18 of Al Jazeera writes that in recent months, talk of potential changes to the Iraqi constitution that could undermine the semi-autonomous KRI status have worried Kurdish officials. Indeed, Hassan of the Small Wars Journals writes that Iraq is on the threshold of a similar crisis similar to the one leading up to the Syrian civil war. Thankfully, Polini reports that the Kurds see the U.S. military presence in Iraq as an essential guarantee of Kurdish autonomy and a form of deterrence against aggression from Baghdad. The Washington Institute 21 warns that removing U.S. forces from Iraq is dangerous, as the gap of mistrust between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurds will surely widen, as the Kurds would be at the mercy of militias, Iran, and the central government. This will trigger a civil war, as K24 in 2020 writes, a potential U.S. troop withdrawal from Iraq could reignite widespread sectarian violence and lead to a civil war. A civil war would be disastrous, as Shapiro of Princeton finds that the last time Iraq had a civil war, over 100 civilians were killed and millions were displaced. This conflict would spread region-wide. As Nowak of the Washington Post explains, a U.S. troop withdrawal would expose a weak Iraq to its powerful Iranian neighbors, increasing weight as the Iraqi scene would be handed over to Iran on a silver platter after the American counterweight vanishes. This is critical. As CSIS 20 writes, the United States has the incentive to stay engaged in Iraq because an unstable Iraq that is dominated by Iran will draw countries located there closer to war. Indeed, Leibson of the Stimson Centers explains that all of Iraq's neighbors are going to interfere in one way or another. They are the ones who are going to get the refugees, the commercial disruption, and the terrorism. Thus, they feed potential conflicts. Our second contention is containing Iranian aggression. Iran will always support proxy groups as sanctions have crippled Iran's economy, with the BBC reporting that as a result of sanctions, Iran's GDP contracted an estimated 4.8% in 2018, with the IMF forecasting zero growth in 2020. As a result, Byman concludes that Iran's economy is weak, giving it little clout in the region. Indeed, Byman writes that supporting militant groups is a way to weaken governments Iran opposes and undermine the positions of regional rivals such as Saudi Arabia or otherwise expand its influence. This is historically proven. As Byman continues that Iran began working with terrorist groups immediately after the revolution because it shared their ideology and ambitions, seeking to export its revolution to neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia and others. As a result, Quadrant in the Hill reports that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its proxies slaughtered thousands of civilians across the region and indirectly supported dictators that caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. U.S. presence is critical for fighting against Iranian proxies, limiting their expansion. Indeed, the RAND Foundation argues that in the example of Syria, one of the most effective bulwarks against further Iranian expansion has been the presence of the Syrian Democratic Forces, until recently backed by the U.S. Special Operation Forces. America's withdrawal from Syria has dangerous consequences, as without the American deterrent, Iran can operate unchecked, resupplying proxies and securing territory that will further empower the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Wahab of the Middle East Forum writes, the withdrawal of the U.S. presence from the region creates a proxy game between regional powers, resulting in a power vacuum that can cause violence and economic depressions. Indeed, Fisher of the New York Times finds that millions more across the Middle East, where proxy fights are likely to play out, would also be at risk. Thus, we negate.
Okay, just need to pull up. Okay, let me know when everybody's ready. We affirm, contention 1 is keep calm and leave the Gulf. The A point is a US-Iranian conflict. This is no joke. The New York Times' Julian Barnes writes on April Fool's Day, tensions with Iran have deepened as a deadly tit for tat has unfolded inside Iraq in the weeks since. In March, Iranian-backed militia groups Kataib Hezbollah launched rocket strikes against U.S. forces, killing 2 American soldiers in hopes of inciting U.S. troop withdrawal. The bottom line is clear. The Washington Post editorial board writes that in March that either Iran will succeed in pushing U.S. forces out of Iraq or it will draw the United States into a larger military conflict. Absent a military downsizing, these strikes will continue. The board furthers that Iran hopes attacks will ignite nationalist sentiments to distract from domestic unrest and views American troops as easy targets, since rocket strikes are not easily countered. After dozens of interviews with Iraqi and American military officials, the New York Times' Mark Mazzetti furthers in March, militia groups inside Iraq seem to be trying to provoke the United States into a bloodier conflict. Worryingly, Mazzetti continues that while Iran can detect attacks in Iraq, Iran may not be able to prevent militia attacks in the face of potential escalation. If Iran continues its onslaught of American soldiers, an American response is imminent. Mazzetti writes that the Pentagon has ordered a campaign to destroy an Iranian-backed militia group that has threatened more attacks against American troops. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper puts it plainly: Iran doesn't get to kill American soldiers and get away with it. Affirming and removing the U.S. military thus prevents further escalation. Simply put, if U.S. troops aren't in Iraq, they can't be killed and the U.S. won't retaliate. The situation is urgent. Mazzetti furthers that top U.S. officials forecast a large strike against U.S. troops in the near future and believe an Iranian response would be hamstrung by the coronavirus, creating the optimal conditions for retaliation. Conflicts with Shiite militias may escalate into war. Barnes explains that U.S. officials are uncertain of Tehran's involvement and are considering a direct strike on the Iranian state. Mazzetti thus concludes this tit-for-tat exchange could draw the United States into a wider war with Iran. The B point is ending the war in Yemen. Since 2014, the Saudi-led coalition has fought Iran-backed Houthi rebels, devastating one of the world's poorest countries. Amnesty International finds in March that the war in Yemen has killed 233,000 and leaves 16 million waking up on the brink of starvation, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The American security guarantee created this war. The Carnegie Endowment's Perry Kamek explains in 2017 that U.S. military presence eliminated the potential repercussions of Saudi Arabia's aggressive and risky actions, encouraging the coalition to intervene in Yemen, a textbook example of the moral hazard problem. The New York University's Mohammed Bazi confirms in 2018 that the security guarantee disincentivizes negotiations as Saudi Arabia believes it can win the conflict with U.S. backing. Conversely, Bazi continues that Saudi Arabia is more likely to accept a peace process if the United States won't provide military assistance. This is empirically confirmed time and time again. After the Iranian proxy's 2019 fall attacks against Saudi oil, the Quincy Institute's Trita Prisa writes in March, recognizing the U.S. military was no longer at their disposal, Saudi Arabia stepped up talks with Iran. Stepped up talks in Yemen. Violence on both sides declined as a result, with an 80% reduction in Saudi-led airstrikes, and there were no Yemeni deaths in the previous 2 weeks. Unfortunately, the peace was short-lived. Prisa warns that a show of military force may once again disincentivize the United States' allies from taking diplomacy seriously. They may even interpret it as a license to resume their recklessness and destabilization in Yemen. The New York Times' Rick Gladstone confirms just 2 days ago that Saudi Arabia broke the week-old ceasefire, launching 25 airstrikes. Removing U.S. military presence is the only way to permanently ensure a chance at lasting peace in Yemen. Every second counts. NBC's Yulia Talazaman quantifies in 2018 that the war-induced famine claims 130 lives every day. For these reasons, we affirm.
Are you ready for cross?
Yeah.
So you talk about how if the U.S. were to withdraw, then it would prevent Iran from continuing to escalate, right?
Yes.
So is Iran going to continue to, in any way, expand throughout the region, even if U.S. were to withdraw? Like, it doesn't have to be against U.S. necessarily, but would they continue to be a threat in the region and try to expand their regional power?
Our argument on contention one is just that there are these proxy groups in Iraq that are trying to bring the United States and Iran to war because they're inciting attacks against the United States and against Iran, and one side blames the other because the United States thinks these groups are involved with Iran. And so, simply put, if the United States aren't there, they can't be attacked, and these Iranian proxy groups can't bring them to war.
So the thing with the Iranian proxy groups is that although they do attack Americans, that's not their sole purpose, right? So they're also going to be there with or without U.S. presence, because what they're trying to do is just becoming a regional power and constantly expanding.
Our argument is just that if the United States isn't there, there can't be a war between the U.S. and Iran.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So can we talk about your argument about, let's talk about your contention two. So you say that, so is your argument that Iran is going to support proxy groups when the United States leaves?
Yeah, we're saying that Iran always supports proxy groups with or
Right.
without the US being there. So that's why you need the US there to contain their aggression.
Okay, so let's ask this then. So Iran is supporting proxy groups right now. They're always going to exist, as your argument.
Yeah.
So is it better to have a power there that could potentially lead to a clash between those two things, or remove one side of that of the equation so that conflict doesn't break out?
So the thing is, the reason that we haven't actually seen a conflict happen between the two states or countries, but the really important part is that because these proxies are always going to be there, we need to have some way to protect the civilians instead of them allowed to go harm. Because if we remove the troops, that gives pretty much Iran the green light to just continue using these proxies and continue doing damage.
The issue is you tell me that Iran always has an incentive to fund these proxy groups. So it's not like they're going to fund more. And the proxy groups obviously are not like
Well,
trying to kill a bunch of civilians because you tell me they just want their own land.
the only reason why, like right now, the proxies aren't doing as much damage as they could be is because the American troops are there to keep them in check. So when you remove them, that's when you give the green light to them and they're allowed to go and.
That's not really true, right? Because the United States is still allies with these nations. There's still that deterrent effect. But
Wait, so if there's no US troops there, how are they going to be a deterrent, right? Like there's no way that they can stop the proxies if they're not there physically.
if like specific groups know that the United States is going to come to back them, then obviously they're
Wait,
not.
that doesn't make sense because the resolution says we're removing troops. So we can't just be like, oh, they can come back when there's a threat.
The resolution says we're removing troops, but it doesn't say that we cut all diplomatic ties between the United States and these groups.
Right, but the crucial deterrent part is our troops being there. But that's correct.
Yeah, but we have like treaties that we would come and back them in the case of this.
All right. I'm gonna start with it's just gonna be down their case. Is everyone ready? Can everyone hear me well? Okay. Time starts now. What we would argue is that both of our contentions are going to be much more important than their case for two reasons. First, what we would argue is that proxy wars across the region are going to be more important because in proxy conflicts, they often cross red lines according to New Republic, meaning that they use more drastic techniques like chemical warfare and also more and more violence as a result, because these are proxies and they're not accountable to any single government because there's often vague funding structures as a result. For this reason, even if you buy that, for example, there's a US and Iran conflict, it's going to get a lot worse if there's proxies across the region than just between two countries. And on Yemen, what we would argue is that there's proxies across the region. It creates multiple different Yemens because now proxies are going as hard as they can to destabilize countries. But secondly, what we would argue is that a civil war that spreads across the region also accesses all of their impacts, but gets worse because now all these countries are siding with different sides of the conflict, and it's going to spread without the region as per our lives and evidence, because each country is going to get the drastic harms of a civil war from all the refugees and terrorism and commercial disruption. With that, let's go into my opponent's case on their first one about the US and Iran. There are three big problems with this. The first is that they never proved that Trump is going to be the one who goes to war, because Trump's previous red line was saying that if US troops are killed, we will go to Iran. But they themselves concede that US citizens have already been killed, which means clearly Trump is not willing to go to war because he's constantly backtracking on what he's said. This is proven when you think of what Trump has in the coming year. He has a re-election campaign, plus he's also facing the coronavirus crisis. And for this reason, Trump is always going to focus on his domestic base than getting involved in another foreign war, which he's always campaigned against since the 2016 election. Secondly, what we would argue is that there's already a decrease in conflict because there's other ways to negotiate between the two countries that have empirically decreased conflict. For example, according to Hinshaw of the Wall Street Journal, there's Swiss mediators and mediators from Oman, which has historically decreased tensions between the two countries. For example, during the Iranian hostage crisis, during the Gulf War, and also during the Soleimani killing, these mediators were the one who decreased tensions and made sure that it de-escalated as a result. Lastly, what we would argue is that Iran is also not going to push to the point where there's war, because even if they prove that tensions are increasing, that does not reach the threshold of war, like my opponents say, because Iran knows if they get into any sort of conflict with Iran, they're almost certainly going to lose, because the US is the world's largest military and has much greater potential. Lastly, what we argue is that the US still has things to be a deterrent, even if it leaves the region. For example, what we would argue is that, never mind. On their second warrant about Yemen, there's 3 big problems with this. First is that you have to look to history as to why the Yemen crisis started. According to Brandt of Bloomberg, the reason why Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen in the first place and started what they call the humanitarian crisis is because the US threatened to pull out and the Obama administration was disengaging from Saudi Arabia, which is why Saudi Arabia felt that they needed to be more aggressive as a result, which means the whole point of their argument and that it's going to get a lot worse in their argument when you pull out of the region. Secondly, what we would argue is that they say that there's a security guarantee, but this has been historically broken as we broke it in the after Iran taxed Saudi Arabia and their oil tankers. What we would argue is that this proves, according to the Carnegie Endowment, that Trump is now willing to protect Saudi Arabia, and it means this emboldenment isn't happening. As the Carnegie Endowment finds that A, Trump doesn't want to support Saudi Arabia anymore and thinks Saudi Arabia should protect itself, but B, Congress isn't supporting of any sort of war, any sort of support for Saudi Arabia because it's very anti-Saudi Arabia. They passed a resolution last year to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Lastly, they say that there was more negotiations. What we would argue is that the reason why these negotiations happened was because of the US, because before these negotiations, there was an increase in troops by 3,000, which is why the US has critical leverage to push for the negotiations my opponents talk about.
We're going to run some prep time starting now.
Read reasons why Iran won't escalate.
I have that here. Read domestic issues, Rubenstein regime survival, Vakil wants to negotiate. This honestly responds to the entirety because their case is one link.
Okay. 152.
That was 1:52 used. I'm going to start by responding to the rebuttal we just heard, and then I'll respond to their case. Is everybody ready? Okay.
Oh, wait, 2 more seconds of prep, actually.
2 more seconds of prep, actually.
$158 total now.
Everyone's good? At the top of our case, they say that proxy and civil wars outweigh. We agree that proxy wars are bad, but the entirety of our argument is that Iran is always going to fight through proxies. The difference here is that the worst scenario we are talking about is where the United States is involved. So all of the actors they talk to you about are still involved in the war. The difference is that you have a great power now involved in it with a much larger military that definitely escalates the magnitude of the conflict. So let's talk about their responses specifically. First, they say, we don't prove that Trump will get to the brink of war. The Mazzetti evidence is super good on this question because it interviews 20 Pentagon officials and finds that all of their impact calculus is saying that if there are continued attacks on US troops, they will invade. These are Pentagon officials, trust their logic as opposed to that of Acton-Boxborough. Second, they say there are other forms of negotiation. Our Barnes evidence post-date system says, even taking that into account, tensions are at an all-time high and ceasefires have been broken, which is why we are probably going to go to war with Iran very soon. Then they say that we do not meet the threshold of Iran wanting to go to war. Two responses. A, the warrant we read in case is that because of COVID-19, Trump thinks that he can win this war because Iran is otherwise occupied and is not at its full strength. But second, the Washington Post evidence we read says that Iran sees this as try or die. They need to get United States troops out of the region or go to war that is functionally conceded. Finally, they say that the United States acts as a deterrent from afar. This doesn't respond to our case because if they are attacking U.S. troops, of course the United States is going to attack back. That's the Mazzetti evidence. But this does take out their case because if the United States acts as a deterrent from afar, for example, in like Iraq and Syria, then there is no way Iran is going to march into other territories because the United States always has that extra deterrent effect. Go to Saudi Arabia. Their first response is that we invaded Yemen because the United States threatened to pull out. One, our evidence post-date and says that the last time the United States tried to pull out, we saw negotiations, not a ramp-up of conflict. But second, Horace explains that MBS is currently facing a succession crisis where his elites want his brother into power as opposed to him. And the only thing that is supporting his play for power is the United States, which is why Mohammed Bazi of The Atlantic explains that in the event that the United States pulled out, MBS would have to posture to the United States by ending the war in Yemen because that is the only way that he can survive. And these are MBS's words directly, trust that over their logic. Then they say that the security guarantee doesn't exist because we didn't back Saudi Arabia. We agree. But Parsi says that when we didn't back their play after the oil tankers were exposed, that's when we saw negotiations. Then they say we sent in troops, which is what caused the negotiations. No, the Davies evidence says that after we sent in troops, we saw a breaking of the ceasefire and a resuming of the airstrikes. We think this outweighs their case, A, because this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. 22 million people are at the risk of starvation right now, and you could save those lives. There is no impact contextualization on their side. You have no clue what you get when you vote for them. Second, we outweigh on probability because historically our argument is true. The Parsi evidence says the last time we pulled out, we saw negotiations. Let's talk about their case. As an overview to the entirety of it, it is imperialist rhetoric framing Iran as a bad actor. In reality, Iran normally does not want to go to war. 3 warrants. A, Reid explains that they are facing domestic issues which they would rather deal with than going to war. B, Rubenstein explains that Iran always prefers their regime survival, so they have no incentive to go to war with Iran. C, Vakil explains that they are simply sick of going to war, and so they are trying to negotiate. But why does that mean they're going to war right now? Because the United States is an imperialist presence on their border in Iraq, which is why they are attacking troops. Normally, they would not be going to conflict, but because the United States is there, that is why they are attacking. So let's talk about their first argument concerning the Syrian civil war. There is no contextualization of this argument. They do not tell you who starts the war. Iraq definitely will not start the war because they are currently dealing with ISIS, so they're not going to start another entire conflict. The Kurds are definitely not going to start the war because they are an oppressed religious minority. There is no incentive for either side to start this war. But second, you can turn it because Hannah 19 explains that the reason why Syria is able to attack the Kurds is because they have 130,000 fighters from Iran, but the reason those fighters are there is because they're there to counter U.S. troops. So if we pull out troops, they no longer have the Iranian forces to attack them. On their second contention about Iran, if we win our first link about the Iranian conflict, we subsume this because we say that Iran has no incentive to expand unless the United States is there. Thank you.
Okay, are you ready for cross?
Yep, I'm good. Actually, let me just pull up the timer. Yeah, good thing you are.
Okay, so all right, let's start on the stuff about Trump, right?
Okay.
So what did Trump say is the reason why he's going to go to war?
I'm not sure, but the Mazzetti evidence is actually the best piece of evidence I have ever cut in my debate career. And it interviews 20 Pentagon officials, and it says, what are you going to do if the attacks on the troops continue? And they all conclude that they will go to war.
Yeah, but they said that if Trump said, and also the Pentagon said, that if one troop dies or one American citizen dies at the hands of Iran, they're going to go to war. And you yourself said that they died. So why didn't they go to war?
Not one troop. It's continued attacks on United States troops.
I'm pretty sure they said one troop. They said if anyone dies as a result of Iran-backed militias, we are going to go to war. And it didn't happen.
Would you like me to send the Mazzetti evidence on the email chain? You can read it as well and be amazed at how good it is.
No, I'm saying the Mazzetti evidence doesn't matter because it just shows that they constantly change their stance every single time. Because no one wants to go to war.
Okay, I can give you a reason why they changed their stance. The evidence we read says that because of COVID-19, they think that Iran is currently weak and are in a great position to attack. Wait.
Yeah, but Trump knew about COVID-19 when he said the one troop thing too.
What? No, he said that back in February. He said that before, during the Soleimani attacks.
Yeah, he knew about COVID-19 since January. That's why everyone's so mad about him.
The nation was in a global lockdown. back then.
What?
Like nations weren't in. The reason he thinks that Iran is weak
Also,
is
like,
global lockdown. But we spent half a crossfire on this. Can I ask you a question?
sure.
So, how probable do you think it is that Iran, currently engaged in like 3 wars and dealing with COVID-19, is going to march into Syria or Iraq?
Our argument's not about Syria.
Or Iraq? Or you said
Our argument,
that they launch a global, like, entire Middle Eastern war. So, how
no,
like
our argument is not that Iran marches into Iraq. It's the fear of more Iranian presence in Iraq or more Iranian control over Iraq, because now they've lost the most crucial counterweight, which is the US, which is why other countries fill in.
wait? So that only happens if Iran actually makes moves to increase its presence in Iraq, correct?
No, our argument is that it's not even about military presence. It's just that if you lose the counterweight with the US gone, then that means that there's literally no opposition to Iran-backed factions within the government.
Wait,
So, for example,
argument that Iran like backs down, does that mean we win that argument as well? Because if Iran backs down, then no one's
no.
scared.
Oh, wait. On your argument about Iran backs down,
Wait, no.
why are they going to back down?
Before we deal with that, can we first establish that if Iran does not escalate things, then like this war does not happen?
No. It doesn't stop the civil war. What we would argue is that A, the civil war still happens because the central government still tries to infringe on Kurdish rights. But B, we would argue that there still is probably going to be some sort of regional spread because there's still a spread of refugees and like terrorism and commercial disruption. Okay. We're gonna take prep. I had that at 2:47.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start on responding to the weighing, and then I'll do my case and then their case. Is everyone ready? Remember the weighing that Akash gives you at the top of rebuttal, which tells you that proxy wars are always going to be a lot worse than conventional wars because they are able to cross the red lines and boundaries that aren't able to happen during a normal war because their proxies are not considered accountable. They give you a response in rebuttal saying that Iran is always going to fight through proxy wars, but it's worse when you involve the US. However, insofar as that we're able to argue that the reason why proxy wars are going to be worse uniquely in our case, when you don't have US there to counteract the Iranian aggression, you're always going to see it be worse because when the US is there, you're actually able to deter it from becoming any worse than it is. That's why right now we haven't seen 6 new Yemen spread out, but once you remove the US, you just see Iran's proxies continuing to escalate and expand. But then we'd also argue we're always going to be the bigger link because we're going to be the ones that are linking into a regional war. That's really important because insofar as that they're only talking about a war between Iran and US and we're impacting out to the entire Middle East, that's always going to outweigh in the amount of people being targeted. But let's go into how we link into a regional war. What we tell you at the top of our second contention is containing Iranian aggression is super important. Right now, Iran is really, really weak. So that's why they have little regional power and want to continue to expand. And the way they do that is through proxies. And they've historically done this through after their revolution. And we've seen that the proxies are really, really damning because they kill a lot of innocent civilians. And the only reason why it hasn't been any worse than it should be is because the US military is there to fight them. However, what Wahab tells you at the end is that a US withdrawal would lead to a power vacuum and lead to violence and economic depression region-wide. That's why Fisher concludes that a proxy war is fought across many regions in the entire Middle East, which puts millions at risk. That's always going to be the most important because that's the impact that affects the most people. They just give you a few responses at the end of the day saying that they would only expand if the US were the only reason why Iran expands if the US were there. But that's in terms of conventional war. The really important distinction between proxies and the Iranian government is that the proxies actually go against what the Iranian officials actually say. They just do in their best mind to try to gain as much land and as much power. So insofar as the only way to actually counteract them, the only way we've seen effective, like in Syria, is through using US military. But let's go into their case. You can start on their first contention. A really big problem here is that they should have already had this entire war triggered because the reason why Trump says he was going to go to war is if any US troops got hurt because it embarrassed him and made Iran seem stronger, so he wanted to retaliate. But insofar as that's never happened, and they just keep reciting, saying that like the Pentagon said it's a continued attack, the Pentagon just keeps changing their stance. So insofar as it's never happened, it will never happen because Pentagon is just never actually going to want to go to war because we have a lot of domestic issues, including COVID-19. Because it's not just Iran that's dealing with it. But then on their second contention with Yemen, a really big issue, they just say that they're outweighing on probability because of their Parsi evidence, which concludes that they were able to negotiate once the US security guarantee broke. But the indictment to that is the reason why the ceasefire actually started is because America had the leverage to use it because of US troops.
We have a minute and 2 seconds of prep time. We'll run that out. Okay. We have 15 seconds left of prep.
Okay. We'll start on the weighing from their summary, then their case, then our case. So they say that their proxy's argument outweighs because proxy conflicts are worse because they can cross red lines. We say that if the United States and Iran go to war, then Iran is still going to use those proxies to engage with the United States in a conflict, and the United States is going to use their allies in the Middle East, which means these proxy conflicts still happen if we win our subpoint A. The difference is you have a massive power war between the United States and Iran, which means the conflict gets worse. So we subsume all there are reasons why proxy conflicts are worse than conventional war because those proxy conflicts are still used when Iran and the United States go to war. Then they say that they impact to a regional war, which is bigger. We say that a regional war would still happen if the United States and Iran got into war. So let's go to their case. They say that Iran is the one that's going to start these proxy conflicts, but they miss the three reasons at the top of Temur's rebuttal as to why Iran does not want to expand in the Middle East. Instead, the United States would be the one to start the conflict. So A, the Reid evidence says that there are domestic issues of unrest. So Iran isn't willing to start new proxy conflicts because they're worried that if those proxy conflicts start, there might be blowback within their own nation. So they aren't willing to do anything about it. Second of all, the Rubin evidence says that they're worried about that their biggest priority is regime survival. So they know that if they start new proxy conflicts, they're worried about potential retaliation because they themselves tell you in their rebuttal, which Temur concedes in his rebuttal, that America still has a deterrent from afar. So obviously they wouldn't start new proxy conflicts. Thirdly, the Vakil evidence says that they're just sick of war, so they don't want to begin new conflict. They want to negotiate with Saudi Arabia. They've already said that they are willing to come to the table. That's the Vakil evidence. It's dropped. It takes out all their arguments because it means that Iran is not willing to start new proxy conflicts. Okay, let's go to our subpoint A. We say that Iran and the United States are getting increasingly close to war. They say that the Pentagon is just shifting their views, and they said if any troops got hurt, it would go in. There are three problems here. First of all, the Mazzetti evidence is that right now the Pentagon is hashing new plans to go to war, and in fact, we're gearing up to go to war right now. We're creating new plans, and we are already planning on going in. So obviously we are, and the reason is that the Mazzetti evidence says the United States said if there were continued attacks on U.S. troops, we would go in, and there are continued to be attacks, which is why we are gearing up to go to war. Second of all, they missed the Barnes evidence that says that the United States thinks that Iran is going to launch a massive attack on their allies, which is why we are creating these plans. The situation is different now because we think that a big attack is coming, so we're going to get out ahead of it and start that conflict. Third, they missed the Mazzetti evidence that says that the United States thinks that Iran is hampered by corona, so they think it's going to be an easy conflict, easy war for them to fight, which is why they're gearing up to go in right now. That's why the situation has changed. And we say that if the United States isn't in the region, they can't go to war. I've already explained why this argument outweighs theirs. The other place you can vote is on our subpoint B about Yemen. We say very simply that the United States is backing Saudi Arabia, so they think they can be as aggressive as possible. However, they say that our timeline is wrong because we sent more troops and that's why negotiations happened. No, they missed our response from the Parsi evidence. It says that when the United States pulled out, that's when we saw negotiations happen. When we sent those troops in, the ceasefire was broken. That's important because we say that 22.5 million people are at the risk of starvation in Yemen, and this definitely outweighs A, on probability because there's very little chance Iran starts new conflicts, and B, it outweighs on magnitude because the other proxy conflicts, there are other proxy conflicts in the Middle East, but none of them are nearly as bad as the conflict in Yemen. So obviously it's a lot worse. Thank you. Please affirm.
Are you guys ready for Grand Cross?
Yeah, good when you are.
So you talk about in summary how Iran, or it was like throughout your whole case, you say that Iran, the US perceives Iran to be weak because of COVID-19, but then also Iran is going to attack other nations. So how is that possible if Iran is weak due to Corona, but then they're also going to be launching big attacks on US other allies?
It's not that like Iran. So the evidence just says the United States has some piece of intelligence and they're worried that Iran might launch a strike. So they're trying to get out ahead of it.
Wait, but that doesn't make sense if like you said that US perceives Iran right now to be weak because of COVID, but then they're also scared that Iran is going to launch this like huge attack that needs like US retaliation.
Let us finish the entire explanation. So the United States got a piece of intelligence that says that Iran is planning a massive attack. So that's one thing. And two, they think separately that Iran is facing domestic struggles, like they're trying to.
But that can't be too.
Sorry, just let me finish this. They're trying to provide healthcare assistance to their people. They're trying to deal with containing the spread. And so they think now would be the best time to attack, especially considering the fact that they think Iran is going to attack. Like,
so then those two things should contradict each other and should take each other out, because if America believes that they're working on domestic issues, that means their other attacks aren't going to happen.
the United States' calculus is that, look, there's two things that are happening right now. One is that the thing is going to happen either way because Iran is going to attack us. But if we attack right now, that's probably the best chance we have of winning because Iran is weakened. They're not contradictory in the slightest.
But okay, we're just going to go around in circles on this. We can get to this and get some speeches, but you can ask a question.
Sure. So why does Iran want to expand?
To become a regional power.
So is that what Iran says, or is that what United States textbooks who want to portray Iran as a bad actor say?
I mean, what do you
It's what
think
historically it's done.
Yeah, like that's what they've always done
Iran has
historically.
been combating U.S. troops, has been combating U.S. presence. They haven't been actively.
Wait, no. For example, after the 79 revolution, they immediately supported terrorist groups, even though the U.S. was not on its borders or threatening them.
Yes,
Wait,
the 79
US
revolution was because the United States did a bunch of shit in the
Yeah, but the U.S. didn't have a presence.
On paper on that last year.
All right, we're going to take the last 15.
I still have another 45 seconds.
Oh, I only said 2 minutes. I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. Keep going.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can continue, I guess.
Okay. So let's discuss the details of the 79 revolution.
So basically, the United States intervened a bunch in Saudi and created a bunch of coups, and then they also intervened in Iran a bunch of times. And then that's when Khomeini took power because they hated.
But that wasn't a presence, right? That was just a limited intervention. Our argument is that with or without the U.S. there, they've always pursued more and more.
Historically, the way that the Iranian regime works is that they survive solely on the perception of the regime and how much power they have. That's why they've always wanted to expand. And even without the U.S. being there, they're not just going to sit there and let them being surrounded by other nations that are all allied together.
Iran has always been super anti-U.S.
From the inception of the current Iranian, the reason that the current Iranian regime is there under Khomeini is because the United States went and backed coups and destabilized the Middle East in the early 70s and 60s, which is why and 50s, which is why Khomeini was able to power.
But that wasn't a response to U.S. presence. Our argument is that with U.S. presence and without U.S. presence, they always expanded.
Fighting coups, that is definitional U.S. presence.
Yeah, but the U.S. didn't have like troops on the ground, for example.
But
Or like a major presence like they do now.
Imperialist actions is still a presence in the Middle East. Like, you can't say that we didn't have a presence in Latin America throughout the 1950s. We still went and we backed coups and we toppled leaders.
Okay.
So we didn't take boots on the ground in a lot of places, but we still had a massive presence there. The same thing is true.
That's cross. All right, we're going to take the last 15 seconds.
Hold on. Okay, I need to call him first. So once the call starts, I'll start prep.
Yeah. Take your time. All good.
Okay. Let's get started on our case and then weighing and then go to their case. Is everyone ready? Our argument is very simple, is that with or without the US in the region, Iran is always going to expand to have some sort of regional power, because without proxies, it has none. For this reason, Byman says that since the 79 revolution, Iran has consistently spread more and more proxy groups across the region to export the revolution with or without the US there, which is why our argument is that you need someone there to make sure that it doesn't go over the edge, it doesn't kill more and more people. Why Rand evidence says the US is the most effective bulwark against ISIS. Without the US, there's going to be a major power vacuum causing millions of people to die. They don't extend any arguments against this in their summary. The only thing they try to get at in their final focus is the idea that Iran doesn't do it and only does it as a response to U.S. aggression. But what our argument is that all these reasons that they give you is the reasons why they're not going to do conventional wars. But it doesn't respond to the fact that they're always going to support proxy wars because they have little clout within the region is the only way for them to spread their influences. So either way, it's going to happen. This outweighs my opponent's argument because they just say that a US-Iran war is going to go regional and there's going to be proxies either way. they never prove why the U.S.-Iran war is going to go regional. The only thing in their argument is saying that's going to stay within Iraq. But secondly, they never explain why the U.S. makes it any worse. Prefer our argument, because we actually give you evidence saying that historically, when the U.S. has fought against these proxies, it's made the wars a lot less worse, and it's been the most effective bulwark against Iraq. With that, even if you don't buy anything I've said in the round, you still cannot vote on their arguments. Because on the first one about U.S.-Iran war, the U.S. has consistently changed its stance around Iran, even with, like I initially said, if any U.S. civilian is going to die, that means we're going to go towards war. But they changed that as a result. It's because no one has an incentive to go to war because of things like Corona, like my opponents say. But secondly is that their argument contradicts itself, because if Iran is weak because of Corona, that means it's never going to expand and cause a major strike like my opponents say. Lastly, on Yemen, the only reason why there was a ceasefire is because U.S. troops were in there to leverage. You can look to history to prove that, as the Brandt's evidence says. The reason why they went in because the U.S. pulled out. Prefer us because there's regional conflicts.
We have 30 seconds left of prep time. We'll run that out.
Because COVID.
Okay, it's going to start on the weighing, then their case, then our case. Is everybody ready? So they keep reiterating that proxy conflicts outweigh, and we agree, but we think that the conflict that we are talking about is going to be a proxy conflict. They say we don't give reasons why. We always have. First is because Iran always fights through proxies, so it's not going to be a direct one-on-one war. It's going to be a proxy conflict. Two is that the United States has mutual defense treaties with things like Saudi Arabia and these other nations, so obviously it would draw it into a longer regional conflict. So whoever wins the link into conflict also wins this weighing. Let's talk about their case and why they're not winning it. They have given you no response to the three reasons we read as to why Iran does not want to get involved in conflict. The Reid evidence says they have domestic issues, and so if they got involved in proxy conflicts, that would definitely cause blowback on them domestically. Second is the Rubenstein evidence that says that they are always interested in regime survival. So if they got involved in proxy conflicts, then other nations would see them as a target and as an aggressive actor, and they would try to attack them, and that would take out the regime. And third is the Vakil evidence that says that they are simply sick of starting wars, which is why they are currently at the negotiating table. All of these respond to the proxy conflict link, and none of them are responded to. The reason this takes out this argument is because it means that Iran will never expand unless the United States is there. It is literally imperialist propaganda that Iran is an expansionist power. They are expanding because the United States is in the region, and they are trying to back them off. So with that, let's talk about our first contention about Iran. They just say that the war should have been triggered already. But the Mazzetti evidence says that we are ramping up new plans to try to invade Iran right now, which means that their argument is fundamentally non-unique. And this outweighs because it is a larger conflict, and you have all of their actors plus a larger state actor that also has nuclear power and also has a lot more weapons. Go to Saudi Arabia. So the only thing they extend is that we invaded Yemen because the United States tried to pull out, and like sending troops is the only thing that caused leverage. One, the Horace evidence, which they concede, says that MBS is facing a succession crisis and the US is the only thing backing him. So his own internal calculus says that he will bow out. And this is literally what he said if the United States pulls out. And second, the timeline is very clear. The Parsi evidence says that when we pulled out, we saw negotiations because Saudi Arabia was no longer invincible. Why does it outweigh? One, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Even if other proxy conflicts are started, you know you can solve the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Second, this outweighs on probability because the historics back our argument, whereas there is very little chance that Iran will embroil themselves in more conflict. We think that even if they win their magnitude weighing, probability is more important because that's what policymakers actually use when they actually evaluate whether or not they should evaluate actual policies, which is why probability is the most important. Vote for probability, vote affirmative.
All right, good round, guys.
Good round.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep this pretty short, I guess. So in the end, I ended up voting for the pro. So for just a couple reasons. So firstly, because the fact that I thought the pro did a pretty good job of countering the point regarding the proxies, and I guess the emergence of more proxy wars after the U.S. pulls out, because of the fact that Iran would have such Iran currently has such destabilizing positions, I guess, within their current within the country right now as a result of COVID, because of the domestic issues and because of the blowback and because of the desire to maintain control of the regime. So that was one point. And then I thought the second point, or the second reason that I voted, was based on the Moretti evidence, which I understood what the con was trying to go for when it said that even Trump knew about COVID a while ago, and even despite that, even though one life was lost, that the U.S. hadn't responded, and therefore it was not necessarily to be considered because the positions change a lot. But then, but the Moretti evidence, I guess, what swayed me, I guess, in terms of towards the pro as opposed to the con on that was the fact that even though Trump had an idea of COVID being there at that time, the positions had even though he had an idea of COVID being there back in January of 2019, the positions changed dramatically because of the fact that Iran is now it's struggling with COVID as a result because of how drastically the situations have changed over the last few months. So I wouldn't say that necessarily it's I wouldn't say it's necessarily that far of a stretch to say that to have these military leaders now assume that Iran is very vulnerable to attack and then be willing to go into Iran and then go to a war with Iran. So I don't necessarily believe that if one person dies and the US will go to war position needed to be maintained at that point, because they need to re-strategize and and figure out a way to get into Iran at that point, right? So then I guess for those two reasons I voted for the pro.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for judging.
Thank you. Good luck.